December 7th, 1941 is indeed a date which lives in US infamy, the day when the US military lost over 2,300 souls, as well as many ships and planes due to a surprise Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. Yet imagine the following: a single modern-day F-15 fighter is sent through time, just before the Japanese attack. How much could it influence the outcome of that infamous battle? Could a single modern plane stop the entire Japanese fleet at Pearl Harbor? Watch the video to find out. What would have happened if the Pearl Harbor tragedy was avoided? Well, it's something that you can play out for yourself. If you give Call of War, which is sponsoring this video, a try. It's free-to-play player versus player real-time strategy game. You choose a real country to lead during World War II, like Japan, the US, or any other of 100 real playable nations. Then you try to conquer the world with your nation. I actually prefer playing with smaller countries. Come on, it's cool when you manage to have Belgium conquer Europe. You can forge alliances with other players. Believe me, as Belgium, you'd need that. Stick around after our video for more game details, but for now, know that you can get an exclusive gift. Just click the link in the description for 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Now we go back to Pearl Harbor. Crucial to the entire setup are scenario specifics. Of course, to make the setup sensible, the plane has to be armed. So we will assume it has purposefully traveled through time and space already equipped with a weapons loadout, having taken off from the base at Pearl Harbor in 2021, full of fuel. Of course, the biggest impact could be done with information. If the pilot of the plane is somehow allowed to warn of an impending attack, and if the pilot arrives early enough, then the US could prepare much better. The essence of the Japanese success was complete surprise. In reality, the US had twice as many fighter aircraft as the Japanese and a similar number of total aircraft, but most weren't ready. So if US defenses had ample warning time, planes and air defenses on the ground and on the ships could make for quite a bloody battle. One in which the Japanese might have lost most of their planes, with very little effect on the US ships, and perhaps ended up with some of their own carriers attacked afterwards. But let us not pursue that line of thought, because if information is sent through time sufficiently early, then no F-15 would be needed at all. Let us suppose that the plane manages to reach 1941 just minutes before the attack starts, with not enough time to alert anyone. Even a message 10 minutes early would likely not amount to much, as who'd believe a mysterious radio call crying wolf? Yet a single modern fighter plane already in the air, appearing high up over Pearl Harbor 10 minutes before the start of the attack, could do a lot. If the F-15 was a fighter variant, how many Japanese fighters could it take down? The F-15C carries up to 8 missiles. The newest F-15EX could realistically carry up to 16. In reality though, some missiles are bound to malfunction, as no missile is even near 100% infallible. World War II fighters wouldn't be hard to track. AMRAAM's Seeker is good enough to track cruise missiles with even smaller radar returns. The F-15 does have multi-targeting capability, so all the missiles would be spent within mere minutes, with 8 to 15 Japanese planes downed depending on the F-15 variant, and possibly still a minute to spare before the Japanese attack starts. The Japanese planes that are targeted would have absolutely no warning or way to defend. Their Zero fighters have no sensors capable of detecting they're being tracked by radar, or that a missile is incoming. The Japanese pilots flying next to their buddies disappearing in sudden explosions would certainly be panicking, but with orders to keep radio silence and without knowing just why their wingman exploded and just how widespread such occurrence is, there wouldn't be any widespread panic in the Japanese ranks. The F-15 could then continue its air attack using its gun. It has a 20mm Gatling gun with a massive rate of fire. Still, the F-15 would need to get fairly close, ideally to just several hundred yards against an alerted plane, but to maintain precision, the F-15 would also need to fly at subsonic speed. It would probably come a little from above and a little from behind, do one gun run and then keep going and accelerating. If the F-15 tried doing a turn and going for another kill right away, it would lose too much speed and energy, and that could enable the escorting Japanese Zeros to try and align a lucky shot onto the F-15. So basically the F-15 would be doing these hit-and-run passes on the bombers, with probably a minute in between each. It would speed up again, find the next target and align itself to attack it. The Japanese would be more alerted and panicking by then, but the whole attack would not likely fall apart. There were many different groups of Japanese planes going for Pearl Harbor, and the F-15 would be attacking and causing panic in just one of those. If the pilot was careful with ammo, the F-15 could likely get away with using less than 100 rounds per attack, possibly downing another 5 to 7 enemy planes. In the grand scheme of things, shooting down some 20 or so Japanese planes out of 183 planes in the first attack wave alone would do some damage to the Japanese, but not too much. It's likely that pretty much all of the ships that were hit in the first wave would still be hit, as the Japanese did not really disperse their attacks, but rather concentrated their planes on several targets. So battleships Arizona, Oklahoma, California, Nevada and West Virginia would likely suffer a similar fate to the ships in the real timeline, as well as cruisers Raleigh and Helena. Just how aware of the new US plane would the Japanese fleet be is very debatable. Certainly the F-15 would be out of ammo, and at a certain point the Japanese would stop reporting further losses from the mystery plane. There would indeed be panic, but many US ships would continue to get hit. This was a do-or-die Japanese attack. Getting cold feet and aborting the second wave when most of the first wave was still a success would not be likely. The F-15 would thus end its fighter run with limited success. It would not be able to really change the outcome of the battle, which would still be an overwhelming Japanese victory. So how could an F-15 change the outcome? By flying through time and space configured for a bombing run. Flying at cruise speed laden with bombs, the F-15 would take a little under half an hour to reach the Japanese fleet. The modern F-15E or EX is equipped with powerful active electronically scanned radar arrays of very high resolution. Basically, they can not only spot ship-sized targets from a few hundred miles away, but they can use their radars to create synthetic images of the targets from over 100 miles away, through clouds and smoke if needed. Given that the Japanese fleet was some 230 miles north of Oahu Island, the F-15 would have little trouble noticing it on radar, almost right away. And its synthetic image radar mode would help it identify exact ship types from still some distance. Furthermore, the F-15 would be carrying, as it usually does on such missions, a targeting pod. It contains cameras, infrared sensors and a laser designator. The pod can yield some fairly detailed images even from 50 miles away. Though if there are partial clouds or smoke, the range drops quite a bit. But the Japanese attack also required good visibility, which is why they attacked on a day which, partly cloudy, still offered decent visibility over that part of the Pacific. The Japanese fleet near Pearl Harbor had no radars back then. The F-15 would be free to waltz in from a perfect route, flying high. It would not only be untouchable, but also hard to see. Some Japanese Zero fighters were patrolling at medium altitudes. Chances of those seeing the lone F-15 flying some 15 to 20,000 feet above them would be extremely slim. Even if somehow those Zeros tried to reach the F-15, they wouldn't make it in time. Their absolute flight ceiling was around the altitude from which the F-15 would be dropping bombs, and reaching such altitude would take 20 minutes for Zeros. There would simply be no time to react. The Japanese ships also had some big AA guns, but none of those could quite reach 10 kilometers up in 1941. Plus, it would take close to a minute for those shells to reach such altitude. Precision would be abysmal. Why bombs for F-15? Well, anti-ship missiles are nice and all, but they're less compact, and the F-15 would be able to carry fewer. Furthermore, their warheads would do similar damage as a 500-pound bomb. For this particular mission, bombs would be the way to go. The key is finding the right size and kind of weapons. Regular JDAMs, as of this moment, are not capable of engaging moving targets, though the US military is working on that too for the future. There is the Stormbreaker bomb that is smart enough to guide itself to a target after release, and they're small enough to be carried in quite large numbers. The F-15E can carry 16 such bombs without sacrificing any fuel. In theory, all 3 fuel tanks could be done without, with the F-15 relying on its internal fuel and the conformal fuel tanks. Even that way, there should be enough fuel for the mission. An F-15 with conformal fuel tanks but no external fuel tanks can carry 16 Mk-82 bombs and fly for 2.5 hours. Not having traveled far, the plane would likely have enough fuel even without any external tanks. So the maximum theoretical bomb load would be 28, which is quite something when each of those bombs is capable of hitting a carrier precisely. Of course, there would be issues with that approach. Some bombs could malfunction. Some could even be shot down. To get into just how much damage those bombs can do, let's first explore just what it took to sink those Japanese carriers. While in the real timeline they were untouched at Pearl Harbor, 4 of those 6 exact same carriers were sunk later on at Midway. Exact number of hits per each carrier are disputed, but the average number of hits seems to be at least 3 with fairly big bombs. They are not only on average 4 times bigger than Stormbreakers, but their warheads were also more suited to the job. Stormbreaker's small warhead is designed to destroy individual tanks, bunkers and pepper the area with fragments. Also at Midway, the Japanese carriers were fairly full of planes, being refueled and rearmed, which facilitated further detonations inside the ships. At Pearl Harbor, with 2 waves launched and some fighters in the air on patrol, the Japanese carriers would have only several fighters on each of them. Most Japanese carriers had lightly armored decks, so some Stormbreakers might even detonate inside the hangar, but the overall impact of each of those Stormbreaker bombs would be much less than the bombs used at Midway. And with 6 carriers, there wouldn't be that many more bomb hits per each carrier than there were at Midway, and the direct effects of each bomb would be several times smaller, and due to fewer planes inside the carriers, indirect effects would be even less serious. Still, even if the carriers would not catch fire so easily, and even if no carrier might be sunk outright, most if not all would have their decks unusable for some time, damaged by 3 to 4 hits each, which means most of the planes the Japanese sent would have no place to return to. The Japanese fleet would try to flee right away. Maybe some carriers would have damaged engines or steering. It's likely that the US forces left at Pearl Harbor would be able to form some attack that could later catch up with those disabled ships and sink them. But could the F-15 attack be even deadlier than that? Maybe so. There are other bomb loadout options to choose from. The F-15 could carry 8 GBU-12 laser-guided bombs, while not sacrificing any external fuel tanks, or 4 GBU-24 LGBs, each weighing 4 times as much. But those hardpoints holding external tanks can hold extra bombs. This image shows JDAMs, but paveways have at times been carried instead. Basically, the F-15 could carry as many as 7 2,000-pound bombs, or if they want to mix it up, 8 500-pound bombs and 3 more 2,000-pound ones. Or perhaps carry one less big bomb for the extra centerline fuel tank. All those bombs would have a much bigger impact on the Japanese carriers, especially the big 2,000-pound ones, as such a class of bombs was not even used at Midway, being too heavy for those planes. Such super heavy bombs have an advantage that older bombs did not have. They can penetrate some 5 feet of reinforced concrete. They would be dropped from high altitude and would amass a lot of speed, while the bombs at Midway were dropped from low altitudes with half the terminal speed. The fuse could be set to go off so the bomb detonates near the keel, or even as the bomb penetrates the ship's keel. There's the case of the German Fritz X bomb as an example in World War II. It too was guided and dropped from some altitude. It was a bunker buster bomb, and out of 3 hits on 2 big modern Italian battleships, 2 bombs went straight through those armored beasts. One was sunk outright, the other heavily damaged. Japanese carriers outside the 2 Shokaku ships had fairly little armor, and even those 2 were nowhere near as sturdy as 45,000-ton Italian battleships. It's more than plausible that a single modern-day 2,000-pound bomb hit, if well aimed, could actually outright sink some Japanese carriers, not just damage them. Of course, ships are compartmentalized. Even a hole might not mean the carrier is done for unless there is gross structural damage to the keel. Though with 4 times as much explosive as the Midway bombs, that too is plausible. Some bombs may malfunction, or be spoofed by smoke, or the aim might be a bit off. Though even so, with 6 bombs at disposal, it's likely that 5 or all 6 carriers would get hit. With 10 bombs, it's likely at least half the carriers would get hit twice. The damage would likely be catastrophic to most. Only the 2 newest carriers of the Shokaku class might escape major flooding if hit by one big bomb, as they were built better. Still, not only would the Japanese fighters returning be doomed, but most of the carriers would likely take on water and would eventually sink, or get disabled so that they couldn't move, resulting in eventual sinking once the World War II US forces react. The Japanese would be lucky if they somehow managed to get 2 or so damaged carriers back home. So the outcome of the whole battle would change quite a bit. What would happen to the second Japanese attack wave? That's impossible to say. Maybe it would get called off. Maybe it would go on, especially knowing there are no carriers to land on anymore. But most of the damage to the US ships and most US lives were lost due to the first attack anyway. The overall outcome, even with the second wave continuing, would still be massively in the USA's favor. Sure, the US would maybe lose as much as it did in the real timeline, but the Japanese would lose basically most of their carrier fleet. The Imperial Japanese Navy had 11 carriers in late 1941. 5 of those were smaller carriers, and 6 were large fleet carriers. All of those 6 were sent on Pearl Harbor raid, including the Shokaku class carriers, which were so new that they weren't even properly tested yet. And this time travel battle would basically take away 2/3 of Japan's carrier capacity, and some 400 planes, and most of their experienced airmen and crew. The battle for the Pacific would essentially be over then and there, with the Japanese having no means to fight the US Navy. Those losses of US battleships at Pearl Harbor would be more than compensated by Japanese carrier fleet losses. The battles of the Coral Sea and Midway would never happen. The Japanese power projection in the Pacific would rapidly shrink, and the whole war might last a year less. Now, wanna learn more about Call of War? Basically, you get to take over the world, engage in epic alternate history World War II battles, and play against real players, so it's pretty challenging. The real-time battles leave little room for corrections, so plan ahead. Basically, you check out the situation a few times a day, give out orders, then come back for resolution. Games can take weeks to complete. You research technology, new units, and even secret weapons. There's a fleshed-out economy system, you can trade resources, and you can play the game for free with the same account on PC and mobile. Optional premium content you can buy, or if you click that link in the description, you'll get 1 month of premium subscription for free, as well as 13,000 gold to kick you off. The offer is available for 30 days only. So try Call of War and change the course of World War II. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.